The billionaire CEO looked at me, then at the crowd behind me and said, "If you're done wasting everyone's time, security will escort you out." People laughed. Standing there in my grease-stained work shirt, surrounded by executives wearing suits that probably cost more than my truck, I probably looked exactly like the joke they thought I was. The funny thing is, I'd already spotted the problem. What I didn't know was that fixing that helicopter was about to uncover a lie that had stolen 12 years from a dying father and his only daughter. A lie so cruel that a man died believing his child no longer loved him. My name is Jake Mercer. I'm a single dad. I own a struggling aircraft repair business, and a few years ago the bank was 30 days away from taking everything I had left. The ending of this story changed everything. Before we get there, take a quick second to join the community by hitting subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. The foreclosure notice arrived on a Thursday morning, folded neatly between a fuel invoice and an overdue electricity bill. I remember staring at it for a long time before opening it because deep down, I already knew what it was. When you've spent nearly 2 years trying to keep a struggling business alive, you develop a sixth sense for bad news. The bank wasn't asking anymore. They were informing me. 30 days. That's how long I had to pay off nearly $87,000 in overdue loans, or lose Mercer Aviation maintenance entirely. I sat alone in my office at Charleston Executive Airport, staring through the dirty window at the hangar I'd spent 16 years building with my own hands. Every toolbox, every hydraulic jack, every stain on the concrete floor carried a memory. My wife Emily used to bring Lily there after school when she was little. Back then, the place had felt alive. After Emily died, the hangar became something else. It became survival. Losing it wouldn't just cost me a business. It would erase the last piece of the life we'd built together. I shoved the notice into my desk drawer just before Lily arrived from school. My daughter was 10 years old and far too observant for my own good. She had inherited that from her mother. For the first hour, everything seemed normal. She finished homework in the office while I worked on a Robinson helicopter that hadn't flown in 3 years. But later that afternoon, I walked back into the office and immediately noticed the drawer was slightly open. The foreclosure notice had been moved. Lily never mentioned it. Neither did I. But that night, while we were eating macaroni and cheese at our kitchen table, she kept looking at me the way people look at someone standing too close to the edge of something. Finally, she asked, "Dad, if we had to move, would I still go to the same school?" I nearly dropped my fork. Kids hear everything. They notice even more. I asked why she wanted to know. She shrugged and said, "Just wondering." But she wasn't wondering. She was worried. And the fact that my 10-year-old daughter was carrying adult fears made me feel like I had already failed her. The next morning, I was drinking coffee before opening the hangar when a news report stopped me cold. Billionaire aerospace CEO Evelyn Hart had announced plans to permanently scrap her late father's legendary Bell 525 helicopter after every repair attempt had failed. The report showed footage of the aircraft being moved inside a private Hart aerospace facility, while reporters discussed the millions already spent trying to restore it. According to the story, military aviation consultants had failed. The original manufacturer had failed. Aerospace engineers from 3 different countries had failed. The helicopter had become a very expensive monument to defeat. I should have changed the channel. Instead, I found myself moving closer to the television. The camera briefly cut to the cockpit before shifting toward the engine compartment. The shot lasted maybe 3 seconds. Most people wouldn't have noticed anything unusual. I did. I rewound the footage and watched it again, then again. Something wasn't right. Not with the helicopter, with the diagnosis. Every expert involved had apparently concluded the aircraft was beyond repair, yet one tiny detail visible on the screen suggested they were all chasing the wrong problem. I actually laughed out loud, not because it was funny, because it was impossible. There was no way dozens of experts had overlooked something that simple. Then again, there was no way my business was surviving another month either. 10 minutes later, I grabbed my truck keys. Against all logic, I decided to drive to Hart Aerospace. Hart Aerospace looked less like an aviation company and more like a private military installation. The moment I pulled my truck through the gates, I knew I was out of place. Luxury cars lined the parking area. Reporters stood behind barricades near the helipad. Men in tailored suits walked around carrying tablets and expensive coffee. And sitting in the middle of all of it was the helicopter. Even from a distance, I recognized it immediately. A custom Bell 525 painted in Hart Aerospace colors. It looked immaculate, which only made the story make even less sense. Machines don't usually fail without leaving scars behind. This one looked almost perfect. I didn't make it 20 feet before security stopped me. I explained that I owned an aircraft maintenance business and wanted to take a quick look at the helicopter. The guard gave me the kind of smile people reserve for children and conspiracy theorists. Before he could send me away, several executives overheard the conversation and wandered over. Apparently, public humiliation is more entertaining when cameras are already rolling. One executive asked if I'd also be fixing satellites while I was there. Another wanted to know whether I had an engineering degree hidden somewhere in my pickup truck. The group laughed. I was about to leave when a tall, silver-haired man stepped forward. Everyone around him immediately went quiet. "Victor Kane," he said, extending a hand I had no interest in shaking. "Chief Operating Officer." I recognized the name. I'd seen enough interviews to know Victor was widely considered the second most powerful person in Hart Aerospace. He looked me up and down before smiling. "You're telling me you drove all the way here because you think you can fix what aerospace engineers, military consultants, and the original manufacturer couldn't?" He didn't wait for an answer. Instead, he turned toward the reporters standing nearby. "Somebody make sure you're recording this. Apparently miracles are landing by pickup truck now." The crowd laughed exactly the way Victor expected them to. That's when I saw her. Evelyn Hart stood near the helicopter speaking with reporters. Even from across the tarmac, she looked intimidating. Perfect posture, perfect suit, completely unreadable expression. Victor walked over and quietly explained why security had stopped me. She barely glanced in my direction before saying, "No." Then she turned and started walking away. I should have left. Instead, I heard myself say, "Give me 3 minutes." Evelyn stopped. The laughter came instantly. One reporter actually asked if I was serious. "I am," I said. Victor shook his head. "Mr. Mercer, this aircraft has defeated people far more qualified than you." "Maybe," I said. "Or maybe they've all been looking in the wrong place." For the first time, Evelyn actually looked at me. Really looked at me. Something in my answer must have caught her attention because after a long moment, she sighed. "You have 3 minutes." Every conversation on the tarmac stopped. 30 seconds later, I was standing beside the helicopter. I climbed into the cockpit, reached behind an access panel, and checked the component I'd seen on television. The problem practically introduced itself. I made one adjustment, reset the system, and stepped back. Nothing happened. Then the dashboard lit up. A second later, the rotors began turning. Nobody laughed after that. I expected Evelyn Hart to thank me, hand me a check, and disappear back into whatever world billionaires disappear into. Instead, less than 24 hours after I fixed her father's helicopter, I found myself walking through one of Hart Aerospace's private hangars wearing a temporary consultant badge. Evelyn had hired me to inspect the rest of Daniel Hart's aircraft collection. "If dozens of experts missed something on one aircraft," she'd said, "I want someone who doesn't think like an expert looking at the others." It wasn't exactly a compliment, but my business was 30 days away from foreclosure, so I took the job. The first thing I noticed wasn't the aircraft. It was the silence. Daniel Hart's photographs hung everywhere. Awards, magazine covers, patents. Entire buildings carried his name. Yet nobody actually talked about the man himself. Employees spoke about him like he was a historical figure instead of a father, friend, or human being. Mr. Hart changed aviation. Mr. Hart built this company. Mr. Hart never accepted failure. But the moment conversations drifted toward anything personal, people shut down. I was inspecting an old Sikorsky helicopter with a senior mechanic named Frank when I casually asked, "What was Daniel Hart like outside work?" Frank tightened a bolt, stared at it for a second, then said, "Brilliant man." I waited. Nothing else came. "That's it?" I asked. Frank lowered his voice. "Around here, we don't talk about family." Then he walked away. Later that afternoon, curiosity finally got the better of me. I was reviewing maintenance records with another employee when I asked how Evelyn had handled her father's death. The man looked genuinely confused. "You really don't know?" he asked. "Know what?" He glanced toward the office windows overlooking the hangar floor before leaning closer. Mr. Hart and Miss Hart hadn't spoken in 12 years. I honestly thought I'd misheard him. 12 years? He nodded. No holidays, no birthdays, no phone calls, nothing. "Why?" I asked. The man shrugged. "Nobody knows. One day they were inseparable. The next day, it was over." That information followed me for the rest of the day. My wife Emily had been gone for 6 years, and there wasn't a week that passed where I didn't wish for one more conversation with her, one more argument, one more ordinary evening sitting across from her at the kitchen table. The idea of willingly refusing to speak to someone you still had the chance to call felt almost impossible to me. Late that evening, Evelyn and I were standing beside an old Bell helicopter reviewing inspection reports when I finally asked, "Can I ask you something personal?" She didn't look up from the paperwork. "You can ask." "Do you always answer?" That earned me the faintest hint of a smile. "No." I took that as permission. "I heard you and your father didn't speak for 12 years. The smile disappeared instantly. For several seconds, the only sound inside the hangar came from the distant hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Finally, she said, "That's true." "Why?" I asked quietly. Evelyn closed the folder in her hands. "Because I stopped pretending." She started walking toward the next aircraft. I followed. "Pretending what?" She stopped again, her back still facing me. "Pretending that he loved anything more than this company." Then she turned and looked directly at me for the first time all day. "The best thing my father ever gave me was Hart Aerospace." There was no anger in her voice. Anger would have implied there was still something left to fight for. What I heard instead sounded colder, final, like a verdict she'd been carrying for years. I watched her walk away across the hangar floor and found myself looking up at the restored aircraft surrounding us. For the first time since arriving at Hart Aerospace, I started wondering whether the broken helicopter was really the story at all. Because somewhere inside that company was a 12-year-old wound nobody seemed willing to talk about. And I had a feeling it hadn't healed. I found the hangar by accident. Hart Aerospace owned 6 active hangars, and during my 3rd day there, I was reviewing maintenance records when I noticed something strange. Every aircraft on company property had inspection logs, maintenance schedules, assigned crews, and service histories. Every aircraft except the one stored in Hangar 8. The building appeared on company maps, but there were no records attached to it. Curious, I asked one of the senior mechanics about it. The man immediately looked uncomfortable. "Forget about that place," he said. "Mr. Hart didn't allow anyone inside." I asked if that rule still applied after Daniel Hart's death. The mechanic nodded. "Especially after he died." The answer bothered me enough that I brought it up later that afternoon while Evelyn and I were inspecting another aircraft. "What's in Hangar 8?" I asked. Evelyn looked genuinely surprised. "I don't know." I thought she was joking. "You've never been inside?" She shook her head. "My father sealed it 12 years ago. Nobody was allowed in." "Why?" I asked. Evelyn looked away. because that's when we stopped speaking. An hour later, we were standing outside a weathered steel building on the far edge of the property. Neither of us said much. The lock had been there so long that it took bolt cutters and nearly 20 minutes of effort to finally remove it. When the massive doors slowly rolled open, both of us stopped moving. Inside sat 3 partially restored helicopters and 2 small aircraft. None of them were luxury projects. One helicopter carried the logo of a children's hospital. Another had emergency medical markings painted across its side. A third displayed a sign reading, Veteran Flight Rehabilitation Program. Workbenches filled the room. Blueprints covered the walls. Entire shelves contained proposals from hospitals, veteran organizations, and emergency relief charities. Every file carried Daniel Hart's handwritten notes. Approved. Move this project forward. Find additional funding. No family should pay for transport. Evelyn slowly picked up one of the folders, then another. She stood there reading in complete silence for nearly a minute. Finally, she said quietly, "The night we had our last argument, he told me he was working." She looked around the forgotten hangar, and for the first time since I'd met her, the certainty in her voice was gone. For years, Evelyn had believed her father cared about only one thing, building his empire and making money. Standing inside that sealed hangar, surrounded by unfinished charity projects he had hidden from the world, she was being forced to consider something far more painful. Maybe she had spent the last 12 years hating a man she never truly understood. And if she had been wrong about this, what else had she been wrong about? I found the voicemails by accident. Evelyn had asked me to inspect several older aircraft stored in a private maintenance building attached to her father's former office. Most of the records had already been digitized, but decades of unopened boxes still filled entire rooms. I was searching for maintenance logs when I noticed an old satellite phone sitting inside a locked desk drawer. The battery was dead, but the phone itself had been carefully wrapped and stored away. Something about that struck me as strange. People don't preserve obsolete technology unless it matters. I charged the phone, intending to hand it over to Evelyn later. When the screen finally came to life, a notification immediately appeared. 37 unheard voicemails. Every message had been left by the same person, Daniel Hart. I brought the phone directly to Evelyn. "I think this belongs to you," I said, placing it on her desk. The moment she saw it, her expression changed. "I haven't seen this phone in years," she said quietly. I showed her the voicemail notification. 37 messages, I said, all from your father. Evelyn frowned. "That can't be right. My father stopped calling a long time ago." She picked up the phone anyway and pressed play. The first message had been recorded 8 months before Daniel died. "Evelyn, it's Dad. I know you're angry, but please call me back when you can. I just want to talk." The second message came 2 weeks later. "I understand if you don't want to see me yet, but I'd really like the chance to explain." Then another, and another. For the next hour, we listened in silence. Some messages lasted less than 30 seconds. Others went on for several minutes. The pattern never changed. Daniel always called. Evelyn never answered. As the months passed, his voice slowly changed. The confident billionaire disappeared. In his place was simply a father trying desperately to reach his daughter. "I miss you, sweetheart. I know I made mistakes. Please don't throw away 12 years because of one conversation." By the 20th message, Evelyn had stopped taking notes. By the 30th, she had stopped pretending she wasn't affected. The final voicemail had been recorded 3 days before Daniel Hart died. His voice sounded weak, fragile, tired in a way that had nothing to do with age. "Evelyn, if you ever hear this, please don't let this be how our story ends." The recording ended. Nobody spoke. Evelyn stared at the phone for several seconds before whispering, "Play it again." I did. When it finished a second time, she quietly said something that changed everything. "I never received any of these." Then, for the first time since I'd met her, Evelyn Hart completely fell apart. Because for 12 years, she had believed her father stopped trying. And somewhere along the way, her father had apparently come to believe the same thing about her. The next morning, neither Evelyn nor I could concentrate on work. The aircraft inspections suddenly felt meaningless. 37 unheard voicemails don't simply disappear by accident, especially inside a company as organized as Hart Aerospace. Someone had to make sure those messages were never delivered. Evelyn spent most of the morning sitting alone in her father's office listening to the recordings again. Around noon, she walked into the hangar carrying the satellite phone. "I need to know what happened," she said, "even if I hate the answer." So we started digging. Hart Aerospace archived everything: emails, visitor logs, security footage, executive communications, phone records. At first, we found nothing unusual. Then one of the senior IT administrators discovered something strange. For more than a decade, all communications sent from Daniel Hart's office had been routed through an executive screening system before reaching their final destination. According to company policy, only one person had complete control over that system: Victor Kane. At first, Evelyn refused to believe it. "Victor worked for my father for 20 years, she said. "He's practically family." But records don't care about loyalty. The deeper we looked, the worse it became. Meeting requests sent by Daniel to Evelyn had repeatedly been canceled before reaching her calendar. Personal letters had been redirected into company archives. Phone calls had been intercepted. Voicemails had been marked as delivered without ever being forwarded. It wasn't one mistake or one misunderstanding. It was a pattern stretching back 12 years. The IT administrator eventually stopped talking altogether and simply turned the monitor toward us. Every action, every deletion, every override carried the same executive authorization code: Victor Kane. The final piece came from internal emails. Years earlier, Daniel had repeatedly instructed his staff to arrange private meetings with Evelyn. Those requests were quietly denied. In separate emails, Victor assured Daniel that Evelyn wanted nothing to do with him and had asked not to be contacted again. At the same time, Victor was telling Evelyn something completely different. According to archived correspondence, he repeatedly informed her that her father had chosen the company over their relationship and no longer wished to discuss the past. For 12 years, a father believed his daughter hated him. For 12 years, a daughter believed her father had abandoned her. Neither of them knew they had both been lied to. Evelyn stared at the screen for a long time before finally whispering, "He died thinking I didn't love him." I didn't know how to answer, because there are some losses that don't leave room for comfort. Sitting in Daniel Hart's office, surrounded by evidence of a betrayal so cruel it barely seemed real, I realized Victor Kane hadn't stolen money or power. He had stolen 12 years, and there was no way to ever give them back. The strange thing about Evelyn Hart becoming part of our lives is that neither of us ever decided it would happen. It just did. A few days after we uncovered the truth about the voicemails, she started stopping by my hangar more often. At first, she always had a reason: new records she wanted to review, questions about her father, another document she thought might matter. But after a while, the reasons became weaker. One afternoon, she arrived carrying coffee and admitted she didn't actually need anything. "I was driving by," she said. We both knew billionaire CEOs don't accidentally drive by small aircraft repair shops on the edge of Charleston, but neither of us said anything. Later that week, she joined Lily and me for dinner after work. Then she came again the following week. Somewhere along the way, it stopped feeling unusual. Children notice loneliness long before adults admit it exists. One Saturday afternoon, I walked into the kitchen and found Lily teaching Evelyn how to make pancakes. Judging by the amount of batter on the counter, the lesson wasn't going well. "Dad," Lily said, "did you know Ms. Hart has never made pancakes before?" Evelyn rolled her eyes. "I'm aware this is apparently a character flaw." Lily ignored her. "What did you do on your birthday this year?" she asked. The question seemed innocent enough. Evelyn stopped stirring immediately. "I worked," she said. Lily frowned. "No, I mean, who came to your birthday?" Evelyn looked down at the bowl in front of her. "Nobody," she said quietly. Lily stared at her. "Nobody at all?" Evelyn shook her head. "No, nobody at all." The room felt different after that. Not awkward, just honest. I suddenly realized I knew executives, investors, politicians, and journalists who would drop everything if Evelyn called. Yet somehow none of those people had shown up for her birthday. Wealth can buy privacy, influence, and beautiful houses overlooking the ocean. Apparently, it can't guarantee that somebody remembers to bring you a cake. Later that evening, after Lily had gone upstairs, Evelyn stood by the front door longer than usual. "Thank you for dinner," she said. "You don't have to thank me every time," I told her. She smiled sadly. "Maybe not," she said, "but nobody's invited me to dinner in a very long time." For the first time since meeting Evelyn Hart, I saw something beyond the expensive suits, private jets, and billion-dollar company. I saw someone profoundly alone. And judging by the look in her eyes, I think she was finally starting to realize she didn't want to be anymore. I found Daniel Hart's hospice nurse almost by accident. Evelyn and I had spent days going through old records, trying to understand what had really happened during the final months of Daniel's life. Most of the people who had worked closely with him either claimed they knew nothing or simply refused to talk. Then one afternoon, while reviewing medical billing records, Evelyn came across a name that appeared repeatedly during the last 6 months of her father's life: Margaret Ellis. According to the paperwork, Margaret had been Daniel's private hospice nurse. Evelyn stared at the document for several seconds before quietly saying, "I've never heard of her." That alone was disturbing. A woman had apparently spent months caring for Daniel during the final stage of his illness, and his own daughter didn't even know she existed. Margaret agreed to meet us at a small cafe overlooking the harbor. She looked to be in her late 60s and immediately recognized Evelyn. "You have your father's eyes," she said softly. Evelyn didn't know how to respond. After a few minutes of uncomfortable conversation, Evelyn finally asked the question neither of us had stopped thinking about. "Did my father ever talk about me?" Margaret looked genuinely surprised. "Every single day," she said. "Mostly, he worried." Evelyn's expression changed instantly. Margaret slowly wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "Your father knew he was dying. He accepted that. What he couldn't accept was leaving without seeing you one last time." Neither Evelyn nor I said a word. Margaret continued. "During his final week, he asked the staff to call you several times a day. He kept saying, 'She'll come. My daughter will come.'" What happened next is something I don't think Evelyn will ever fully recover from. Margaret told us that during Daniel's final 24 hours, doctors strongly recommended increasing his pain medication. Daniel refused. According to Margaret, he said the same thing every time. "Not yet. I need to stay awake in case Evelyn comes." He waited all night, then all morning, then most of the afternoon. "He kept asking what time it was," Margaret said quietly. "He didn't want to miss you." Eventually, Daniel lost consciousness. He died less than an hour later. Evelyn finally managed to ask the question she was clearly terrified of hearing answered. "Did I ever make it there?" Margaret lowered her eyes. "You arrived about 30 minutes later." For several seconds, Evelyn simply stared at her. Then she whispered, "No." Margaret nodded sadly. "I'm sorry." Everything holding Evelyn together seemed to disappear at once. Because for 12 years, she had believed her father stopped fighting for their relationship. The truth was far crueler. Daniel Hart died waiting for his daughter, believing she had chosen not to come. And Evelyn had spent the last 8 months believing he hadn't wanted her there at all. The drive home from meeting Margaret was painfully quiet. Evelyn stared out the passenger window almost the entire time, saying nothing. I didn't push her. Grief has its own timetable, and I'd learned after losing Emily that forcing people to talk usually accomplishes nothing. When we reached my house, Evelyn thanked me for driving and said she should probably leave. Before she could reach her car, Lily opened the front door and came running outside. "Miss Hart," she shouted, "you're staying for dinner, right?" Evelyn hesitated. For a second, I thought she might say no. Instead, she nodded. "If your dad doesn't mind." Lily smiled. "Dad always makes too much food anyway." Dinner that night felt different. Evelyn barely touched her meal. Lily noticed immediately. Children always do. Halfway through dinner, Lily put down her fork and asked, "Are you sad because of your dad?" Evelyn looked surprised. "What makes you think that?" Lily shrugged. "You look the way Dad looked after Mom died." The room went quiet. Evelyn tried to smile, but it didn't last. "My father and I had problems," she said carefully. Lily thought about that for a moment. Then she asked the question that changed everything. "If he loved you, why didn't you forgive him?" Evelyn stared at her as if she'd been hit. "I don't know," she said quietly. It was the first honest answer I'd ever heard her give about Daniel Hart. After Lily went upstairs, Evelyn remained at the kitchen table long after the dishes had been cleared away. "I wasted 12 years, she finally said. "I could have called him, even once." I told her she didn't know the truth. None of us did. Victor had spent years poisoning both sides, but Evelyn shook her head. "There were birthdays," she said softly. "Holidays, opportunities. I told myself I had reasons. Maybe I did at first. But after a while..." She stopped talking. She didn't need to finish. Guilt had finally found her, and I recognized the look in her eyes because I'd spent years carrying my own. The difference was that my regrets involved things I never had the chance to say. Evelyn's involved things she had chosen not to say. Something changed after that night. Evelyn started showing up at the house more often, and eventually nobody questioned it anymore. She helped Lily with homework. She joined us for dinner several nights a week. On Saturdays, she somehow became part of our grocery shopping routine, despite initially having no idea how to shop for anything that didn't come with an assistant. The first time she tried making pancakes with Lily, they nearly set off the smoke alarm. Lily thought it was hilarious. So did I. Somewhere between burnt pancakes, homework assignments, and quiet dinners around our small kitchen table, the house began feeling different. Warmer, lighter, alive in a way it hadn't since Emily died. The strangest part was that none of us ever talked about what was happening. Evelyn never said she was lonely. Lily never said she needed her. I never admitted that I had started looking forward to the sound of her car pulling into the driveway. But feelings have a way of making themselves known even when nobody says them out loud. And for the first time in years, all three of us were beginning to feel like something dangerously close to a family. Victor Kane struck on a Monday morning. I knew something was wrong the moment I pulled into my hangar and saw 3 news vans parked outside the gate. Reporters had never come to my shop before unless they wanted a quick comment about the helicopter. This felt different. The moment I stepped out of my truck, microphones appeared in front of my face. One reporter asked whether I planned to move into Evelyn Hart's mansion. Another wanted to know if I had targeted Evelyn from the beginning. A third asked how much money I expected to receive if the relationship became permanent. For several seconds, I honestly thought they had mistaken me for somebody else. Then one reporter handed me a tablet. The headline on the screen read, "Small-town mechanic manipulates grieving billionaire CEO." There were anonymous sources claiming I had intentionally repaired Daniel Hart's helicopter to gain access to Evelyn. Another article suggested I had moved closer to Hart Aerospace months before the helicopter incident and had spent years positioning myself to meet her. None of it was true. All of it was believable enough to spread. By lunchtime, the story was everywhere. Financial networks discussed me. Social media tore me apart. Complete strangers called me a gold digger, a con artist, and a professional opportunist. The worst moment came when a reporter approached Lily outside school and asked whether she was excited to become the billionaire's daughter. The school immediately contacted me, but the damage had already been done. That night, Lily sat quietly at the kitchen table, pushing food around her plate. Finally, she looked up and asked, "Dad, are people saying bad things because of Ms. Hart?" I told her adults sometimes say things that aren't true. She nodded, but children know when they're being protected. After she went upstairs, I sat alone in the kitchen feeling something I hadn't felt in years: shame. Not because I believed the stories, because I knew what public scandals do to children. Evelyn called just after 10. I could hear voices in the background. "The board held an emergency meeting," she said. "Victor convinced several directors that our relationship represents a serious conflict of interest." According to Victor, Hart Aerospace was facing reputational damage because its CEO had become emotionally compromised. Several board members demanded that Evelyn either remove me from all company business or step aside temporarily while an investigation took place. I actually laughed when she told me. The man who had spent 12 years destroying a father-daughter relationship was suddenly presenting himself as the protector of corporate ethics. Evelyn didn't laugh. "They're serious, Jake," she said quietly. "If enough directors vote against me, I could lose the company." I barely slept that night. I kept thinking about Emily, about promises I'd made while sitting beside her hospital bed. Protect Lily, keep her safe, give her stability. By morning, I'd made my decision. I drove to Hart Aerospace carrying a single envelope. Evelyn was waiting in her office. She looked exhausted. Without saying a word, I placed the envelope on her desk. She opened it, read the first page, and immediately looked up. "You're resigning?" I nodded. "Victor wants me gone. If I leave, this ends." Evelyn stood up so quickly her chair nearly fell backward. "No, it doesn't," she said. "It means he wins." I shook my head. "Maybe, but I'm not going to be the reason you lose your company." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Evelyn quietly asked, "What if losing you matters more?" I didn't answer because the truth terrified me. I turned and walked out anyway. I had every intention of leaving Hart Aerospace for good. After resigning, I drove back to my hangar and threw myself into work, hoping greasy engines and overdue invoices would drown out everything else. They didn't. For the next 3 days, Evelyn didn't call. I told myself that was for the best. Then, early Friday morning, she showed up at my shop carrying a weathered leather notebook pressed tightly against her chest. She looked exhausted. Not physically, emotionally. "This was delivered to my office yesterday," she said quietly. "One of the archivists found it hidden behind a maintenance panel inside my father's helicopter." I recognized the worn Hart Aerospace insignia stamped into the leather immediately. Daniel Hart's personal flight journal. We spent the next several hours sitting in my office reading it together. Most of the journal looked exactly like you'd expect from an aviation pioneer. Flight hours, fuel calculations, maintenance observations, notes about weather conditions and aircraft performance. Then, approximately a year before Daniel's death, the entries changed. The technical language slowly disappeared. In its place appeared something much more personal. Daniel openly discussed his diagnosis: pancreatic cancer, advanced, aggressive, untreatable. According to the journal, doctors had given him less than a year to live. The first entry after his diagnosis stopped both of us cold. "Today I learned I am running out of time. Unfortunately, time is the one thing I wasted most with Evelyn." Evelyn immediately closed the journal and stared out the window. It took her nearly 5 minutes before she was able to continue reading. The deeper we went, the more painful it became. Daniel wrote about calling Evelyn and receiving no response. He wrote about birthdays he spent waiting for phone calls that never came. He described sitting alone in his office every Thanksgiving, hoping she might walk through the door. Yet the most heartbreaking part wasn't his grief. It was his certainty that he deserved it. "Perhaps this is the price fathers pay for confusing sacrifice with love," one entry read. Another simply said, "I built a company and lost my daughter." By the middle of the journal, Daniel had clearly realized he was dying faster than expected. That's when the entries became strange. He began documenting names, dates, archived files, meeting locations, and specific employee records. Entire pages contained references that meant nothing to us at first. Then Evelyn noticed something. Every clue eventually pointed back toward Victor Kane. Near the final pages, Daniel finally explained everything. Years earlier, he had discovered that communications between himself and Evelyn had been blocked. By the time he uncovered Victor's manipulation, their relationship had already collapsed. According to Daniel, confronting Evelyn directly would only have made things worse because she no longer trusted him. Instead, he began quietly gathering evidence. He documented every suspicious conversation, every intercepted message, and every falsified report. Most importantly, he created a trail designed for one purpose: helping Evelyn discover the truth after he was gone. "If I cannot repair what has been broken while I am alive," he wrote, "perhaps I can still leave her a map home." The final entry had been written less than 2 weeks before Daniel died. "The helicopter remains unfixed. I could repair it tomorrow if I wished. I choose not to. Evelyn has always hated unfinished things. One day she will try to save it. When she does, someone honest will begin asking questions. That person will find the journal. If you're reading this, then my plan worked. Evelyn, if you are here, then you finally know the truth. I never stopped loving you, not for a single day." When Evelyn finished reading, she quietly closed the journal and held it against her chest. Neither of us spoke for a long time. Daniel Hart had turned a broken helicopter into his final message to his daughter, and somehow, from beyond the grave, he had finally reached her. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for 9 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, but by 8:30, Hart Aerospace headquarters already looked like a crime scene disguised as a corporate event. News vans lined the street. Reporters crowded the entrance. Shareholders whispered in small groups throughout the lobby while executives avoided eye contact altogether. Victor Kane had spent weeks preparing for this moment. According to the media narrative he had carefully built, I was a manipulative outsider who had taken advantage of a grieving billionaire, and Evelyn Hart was an emotionally compromised CEO who could no longer lead the company objectively. Most people entering that boardroom fully expected Evelyn to be removed before lunch. Victor certainly did. When Evelyn and I walked through the lobby together, he greeted us with the confident smile of a man who believed he had already won. "You can still avoid all this," I quietly told Evelyn outside the boardroom doors. She shook her head. "My father lost 12 years because everyone stayed silent," she said. "I'm done being silent." The meeting began exactly as Victor had planned. For nearly 40 minutes he presented charts, financial projections, media reports, and legal opinions. He argued that Hart Aerospace was suffering reputational damage because of Evelyn's personal involvement with me. He accused her of allowing emotions to interfere with executive judgment and insisted the company required stable leadership during uncertain times. Several board members nodded along. Others simply looked exhausted. When Victor finally finished, he sat down with complete confidence. Then Evelyn stood. Without saying a word, she placed Daniel Hart's flight journal on the conference table. "Before you vote today," she said quietly, "there are things you deserve to know about my father, about this company, and about the man sitting across from me." The room immediately fell silent. Evelyn began by explaining the unheard voicemails, the intercepted letters, and the cancelled meetings. Victor interrupted almost instantly. "These accusations are absurd," he said sharply. "You're grieving and clearly not thinking rationally." Evelyn never even looked at him. Instead, she pressed a button on the conference room screen. Company records appeared showing years of intercepted communications routed through executive screening systems, controlled exclusively by Victor Kane's authorization credentials. Then she called witnesses. Frank Morrison, a senior IT administrator who had spent 32 years at Hart Aerospace, testified that messages from Daniel Hart had repeatedly been redirected, hidden, or marked as delivered without ever reaching Evelyn. Daniel's former executive assistant testified that Victor regularly instructed staff to cancel meetings, while falsely claiming scheduling conflicts. Another employee confirmed personally delivering letters from Daniel that were later discovered unopened inside company archives. With every testimony, the atmosphere inside the room changed. Board members stopped taking notes. Several openly stared at Victor in disbelief. Yet Victor continued denying everything. Finally, Victor stood and said, "Even if these records are authentic, you still have no proof Daniel Hart disagreed with any of it." For the first time that morning, Evelyn looked directly at him. "Actually," she said softly, "I do." She reached into her father's flight journal and removed a small digital recorder discovered alongside the notebook. "My father left this behind because he knew someone would eventually need to hear the truth." She pressed play. Daniel Hart's voice immediately filled the boardroom. "Victor, if you've interfered with my relationship with my daughter, I will never forgive you." Victor's voice answered seconds later. "Daniel, I'm protecting the company. She doesn't want a relationship with you anymore. You need to accept that." Daniel responded quietly, "You're lying, and someday she'll know it." The recording ended. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. For several long seconds, the only sound inside the boardroom came from the air conditioning system overhead. Victor looked around the room, searching desperately for support. But the expressions surrounding him had completely changed. Some directors looked furious, others looked sick. One elderly board member slowly removed his glasses and whispered, "My God." Questions came immediately. How long had Victor been manipulating company communications? Who else knew? How many decisions had been influenced by lies? Victor attempted to defend himself, but the confidence that had defined him all morning was gone. Within 30 minutes, the board voted unanimously to terminate his employment, revoke all executive privileges, and authorize an independent investigation into his actions. By the time reporters learned what had happened, Victor Kane had already left the building through a private exit, escorted by security officers he had personally hired years earlier. Hart Aerospace had lost its most powerful executive, but something far more important had happened that morning. For the first time in 12 years, Daniel Hart's voice had finally reached his daughter. And for the first time in 12 years, the truth had finally been heard. The crisis ended the way most crises do, quietly. Victor Kane disappeared from the headlines almost as quickly as he had dominated them. The board publicly reaffirmed its support for Evelyn, the media moved on to newer scandals, and Hart Aerospace slowly returned to normal. My own life, however, felt anything but normal. For weeks, I'd convinced myself that leaving had been the right decision. The company was stable again. Evelyn's reputation had been restored. Daniel's truth had finally been revealed. The reason I'd entered their world in the first place, a broken helicopter, had long since stopped mattering. So one Friday evening, after Lily had gone to bed, I sat alone at the kitchen table and made a list of everything that needed to happen before we moved on. I would finish the remaining consulting work, return to running Mercer Aviation full-time, and put some distance between ourselves and Hart Aerospace. It sounded logical. Safe. Emily used to tell me that whenever I was afraid of losing someone, I turned my feelings into logistics. Sitting there with a legal pad in front of me, I realized I was doing exactly that. I told Lily the next morning while we were eating breakfast. "Things are going back to normal," I said. "Ms. Hart probably won't be around as much anymore." Lily stopped eating immediately. "Why?" she asked. I explained that Evelyn was busy running a company and that our lives had simply gotten complicated. Lily stared at her cereal bowl for several seconds before quietly asking, Did she do something wrong? No, I said. Then why does she have to leave? Children have a remarkable ability to ask questions adults spend months avoiding. I tried explaining that some people come into our lives for a season. Lily pushed her chair back. Mom came into our lives forever, she said. Maybe Ms. Hart did too. Then she walked upstairs. An hour later, Evelyn arrived for what she believed was an ordinary Saturday visit. The moment she stepped through the front door, Lily wrapped her arms around her and started crying. Not polite tears, real ones. The kind children save for things they genuinely cannot bear. It took nearly 20 minutes before Lily was able to speak. Dad says you're leaving, she finally whispered. Evelyn looked at me across the room, confused. I nodded. I thought it would be easier this way. Evelyn gently pulled away from Lily and asked if we could talk outside. We stood on the back porch in complete silence for almost a minute. Finally, she said, "You don't get to decide what's easier for everyone else." I started explaining that her company needed her attention and that Lily and I would be fine. Evelyn shook her head before I could finish. "Stop doing that," she said. "Doing what?" "Pretending you're protecting people when you're really protecting yourself." The words hit harder than I expected because they were true. I looked away. "I already lost my father," Evelyn said quietly. "I'm not losing you too." For a second, neither of us moved. Then, with tears in her eyes, the billionaire CEO who had once intimidated entire boardrooms said the one thing I never expected to hear. "Please don't leave," she whispered. "Both of you. Stay. I don't want this house to be another place I visit, only in memories." I didn't answer Evelyn that afternoon. Not because I didn't know what I felt. The truth was, I'd known for a long time. I'd known the night she stayed with Lily in the emergency room without being asked. I'd known the afternoon she showed up at my hangar with coffee simply because she thought I looked tired the day before. I'd known the first time I heard Lily laughing in the kitchen and realized it had been years since our house had sounded that alive. What I didn't know was whether I had the courage to risk losing all of it. Loving Emily had been the easiest thing I'd ever done. Losing her had been the hardest. Somewhere along the way, I'd convinced myself that protecting my heart was the same thing as protecting my family. Evelyn waited quietly while I searched for words. Finally, I said the only honest thing I could. "I'm scared." She nodded. "So am I." Then she smiled through tears and added, "I think that's probably a better foundation for a relationship than pretending we're not." For the first time since Emily died, the future didn't feel like something I had to survive. It felt like something I wanted to walk toward. So Lily and I stayed. The months that followed changed all three of us. Hart Aerospace publicly announced the Daniel Hart Foundation, an organization dedicated to restoring medical transport aircraft, emergency response helicopters, and veteran rehabilitation programs, the very projects Daniel had hidden inside Hangar 8. Evelyn insisted that Mercer Aviation become the Foundation's primary restoration partner. Within a year, my struggling two-man operation had grown into one of the most respected specialty restoration businesses on the East Coast. We hired additional mechanics, expanded into a larger facility, and for the first time in my life, I stopped worrying about losing everything every time the phone stopped ringing. Yet the real changes happened at home. Evelyn never officially moved in. One day she simply left a toothbrush in the bathroom. A few weeks later, clothes appeared in the guest room. Then one evening, Lily casually referred to our house as home while talking to Evelyn, and none of us corrected her. Families don't always arrive with grand announcements. Sometimes they form quietly, one ordinary day at a time. Evelyn's relationship with her father remained more complicated. Forgiveness rarely happens all at once. Some nights she would sit alone on the back porch holding Daniel's flight journal, reading the same pages repeatedly. Other nights she would talk about him for hours, The funny stories came first. The painful memories took longer. One Sunday afternoon, nearly a year after everything happened, Evelyn asked if I would go with her to the cemetery. We stood beside Daniel Hart's grave for almost an hour before she finally spoke. "I spent 12 years being angry at a man who never stopped loving me," she said quietly. "I don't know how to live with that." I squeezed her hand and told her something I'd learned after losing Emily. Grief isn't something you finish. It's something you carry. The weight never disappears. You just grow strong enough to carry it differently. Evelyn nodded, then placed a small model helicopter beside her father's headstone. "I'm sorry I didn't come sooner," she whispered. It wasn't much, but it was forgiveness. 5 years later, Daniel Hart's helicopter still sits inside the main Hart aerospace hangar, fully restored, fully operational. Every new employee hears its story during orientation. Most people think it's there because it represents innovation or perseverance. They're wrong. The helicopter remains because it reminds us that broken things are not always what they seem. Sometimes the engine isn't the problem. Sometimes the real damage exists somewhere nobody thought to look. Lily is 15 now. She still burns pancakes. Evelyn still pretends she doesn't need help making them. And every year on the anniversary of Daniel's death, Evelyn listens to his final voicemail. She always cries. She always smiles afterward. The last time I asked why, she handed me the phone and said, "Because I finally hear what he was really trying to say." After all these years, Evelyn Hart finally understands something that once seemed impossible to believe. Her father never stopped loving her. Not for a single day.